A clang. A door slams. Blood trickles down the pale concrete wall. In a small 8 by 10-foot cell at ADX Florence, an inmate lies unconscious, hands bound, a tube down his nostril, stomach pumped with liquid he tried to reject. He vomits. Over and over. Guards stand behind glass. Cameras roll, but there is no one to hear his screams. This is what they call force feeding. This is how hunger fights back. He awoke hours later, weak, skin scraped, voice barely there. He was one of dozens in that unit who tried to starve themselves, not in madness, but to demand dignity. And somewhere in the bowels of America's most secret prison, another man quietly took his life. He hung himself, in solitary isolation, and no one saw him go. So I ask you, what could drive a man to stop eating, and another to end it all, within walls built to break souls? You're about to see how a fortress of steel and concrete became a battleground of silence, pain, and secrets that the world has never fully heard. The sound came first, sharp, metallic, and final. A door slammed shut, and the echo crawled through the concrete corridor like thunder trapped in a tunnel. Inside that room, the light was white and merciless. A man sat strapped to a restraint chair so rigid that even breathing felt like resistance. His name tag read Cruz, Jonas, though no one had spoken it aloud in weeks. The air smelled of antiseptic and fear, and somewhere beneath it all, the sour tang of vomit. The tube slid into his nostril, slow and deliberate. The nurse, or maybe she was just a technician, didn't make eye contact. The guards behind the reinforced glass didn't flinch. The only movement came from the thin line of liquid dripping from a clear plastic bag into the tube. It flowed down into his stomach, bypassing the hunger that had defined his protest for more than a month. His eyes flicked open briefly, cloudy and red-rimmed. The straps on his wrists were biting deep, his tattooed forearms slick with sweat. The black phoenix inked on his skin looked like it was trying to tear free. He tried to speak, but the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a dry rasp, a cough that turned into a choke. He vomited what little remained in his gut, but they didn't stop. The feed had to finish. Orders. Always orders. Outside the glass, the officer wrote something on a clipboard. No one said a word. The silence was policy here. This was ADX Florence, the Supermax prison built in the mountains of Colorado, where the worst of America's offenders were buried alive in time. A place designed not to punish the body, but to erase the mind. Jonas had arrived 4 years earlier, transferred from another federal penitentiary after he was labeled high risk. It was supposed to be temporary, but time at ADX never worked like time outside. Days dissolved into sameness, and sameness became madness. His cell was an 8 by 10 concrete box with a narrow slit of glass for a window. Through that slit he could see nothing but sky, too far to touch, too indifferent to care. His meals arrived through a steel slot. His recreation was an hour a day in another concrete pen, alone, staring at another wall. When he spoke, no one answered. When he wrote letters, they were returned censored, black bars cutting through his sentences like scars. He had started the hunger strike after months of filing grievances that went nowhere. It began small, skipping breakfast, then lunch, then dinner. On day 5, he collapsed during cell inspection. On day 7, his weight had dropped by 15 pounds. On day 9, his urine was dark and his vision blurred. By day 12, he couldn't walk. The Bureau of Prisons policy was clear. If an inmate refused food beyond a certain threshold, the medical team intervened. They called it medical care. The inmates called it force feeding. But Jonas was not the first. Others had done it before him. Men like Omar Kane, who had gone on strike demanding fair treatment under special administrative measures, and Marcus Reed, covered in serpent tattoos curling up his neck, who wanted nothing more than to hear his daughter's voice on a call. Each of them had refused meals. Each had been strapped into the same chair. And each had learned that pain was just another form of silence here. Down the corridor, that same morning, another inmate's silence became permanent. His name was withheld from the press, as always. He had torn his bedsheet into a rope, tied it to the vent, and stepped off the edge of his concrete bunk. When they found him, his body was cold but calm. The officers cut him down, zipped the bag, and wheeled him past Jonas's cell. The hallway light flickered once as they passed. Jonas saw the outline of the stretcher through the door slit, white sheet, covered face. For a moment, he wondered if this was victory or defeat. Maybe the man had found a way out that the rest of them never could. No one spoke of it. They never did. Suicides inside ADX were statistics, not stories. The official reports were dry. Inmate found unresponsive. CPR administered. Pronounced dead at facility. But behind each of those lines was a man who had spent years talking to walls, scratching messages into concrete, begging for someone to answer. Jonas was returned to his cell that afternoon, his stomach bloated, his throat raw. The feeding tube had left a thin cut inside his nose that stung with every breath. He leaned back against the wall, eyes fixed on the tiny square of sky. In that rectangle of blue, a bird passed by, distant, weightless. He imagined it was the same phoenix tattooed on his arm, escaping where he couldn't. Night in ADX wasn't truly night. The lights dimmed but never went dark. The hum of the ventilation system was constant, a mechanical whisper reminding him he was never alone but always isolated. Somewhere down the hall, a man screamed, not from pain, but to hear his own voice echo. Guards ignored it. The sound would fade, as it always did. In another cell, Omar counted the seconds between footsteps. He was on day 20 of his own strike, ribs visible, lips cracked. He could smell the faint trace of disinfectant from Jonas's earlier feeding. He whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for someone to remember that they once existed beyond these walls. The facility itself felt alive, cameras blinking red, motion sensors flickering. Every inch of ADX was designed for control, motion-activated doors, laser-sealed corridors, surveillance even inside the shower stalls. The architects had called it the cleanest prison ever built. But there was nothing clean about what happened inside. When Jonas finally slept, his dreams were bright and chaotic. He saw open fields, a table with food, voices of people laughing somewhere far away. But when he opened his eyes, the same four walls swallowed him whole. His breath fogged the air slightly, just enough to remind him that time was still moving. He pressed his hand against the wall, feeling the vibrations of someone pounding 3 cells away. Coded knocks, desperate communication that no guard could decipher. It was how they spoke now, through rhythm and concrete. Weeks passed, and the hunger strike spread. 10 men in the unit refused meals. Guards patrolled slower, quieter. Journalists sent inquiries. The Bureau of Prisons replied with one-sentence statements. The outside world had no idea what was unfolding behind the high fences and gun towers of Florence, Colorado. Then, one morning, Jonas heard the alarm, a shrill electronic wail that tore through the silence. Footsteps thundered. Orders shouted. The metallic click of cuffs, the slam of doors. He pressed against his door slit, heart pounding. Down the hall, Marcus Reed was being dragged out, limp, tattoos dark against pale skin. His hunger strike had reached its final hour. For the first time in months, Jonas felt something close to fear, not for himself, but for what would happen next. Would they cover this one too? Would another anonymous line in a press release replace a man's life? When the noise faded, all that remained was the hum of electricity. Jonas sat down slowly, the restraints from his last feeding still marking his wrists. He stared at the opposite wall and whispered a single word that no one would ever hear. By the time the lights dimmed again, he was already planning his next move. He would write. He would strike again. He would not disappear quietly. Somewhere inside him, the phoenix still burned. And as the night deepened, the silence pressed back harder, heavier, thicker than before. It was the kind of silence that could crush the mind, the kind that could make a man forget his own name. But not tonight. Not Jonas Cruz. Outside his cell, the wind howled over the Colorado plains, whistling through razor wire, blending with the mechanical heartbeat of the prison. Inside, a single thought formed, small but dangerous, a spark flickering in the dark. What happens when a place built to erase every voice becomes the loudest scream of all? Before the hunger strikes, before the suicide gurneys rolled down the narrow hallways, before Jonas Cruz's body was tethered to a feeding chair, there was an idea, a dream sold as necessity. A dream wrapped in the language of safety. It began in the early 90s, in the aftermath of chaos. American prisons were burning from within, riots in Illinois, stabbings in Atlanta, gang wars in Leavenworth. The government wanted control, not conversation. They wanted a place where no one could organize, rebel, or breathe without permission. In 1994, the blueprint was drawn. a maximum security prison unlike anything the country had seen. ADX Florence, the administrative maximum facility, was to be the final stop for the most dangerous men alive. Built deep in the Colorado mountains, surrounded by endless desert and rock, the prison was designed to break what bullets and bars could not: the human spirit. Every wall was layered with reinforced concrete. Every door operated remotely from a central control room. Every inmate monitored 24 hours a day. There were no bars, just steel and silence. No windows you could see through. Only narrow slits angled toward the sky, so you could never see the horizon. Freedom was visible, but unreachable. When the first prisoners arrived in 1995, reporters called it the cleanest, quietest prison in America. The guards called it the vault. To the men sent there, it was burial without death. Jonas Cruz was 16 when ADX opened. He grew up in a small industrial town outside Detroit, where sirens were part of the night soundtrack. His father was a factory worker who came home coated in grease. His mother cleaned offices downtown. Jonas spent his teenage years skating between poverty and survival, school by day, petty trouble by night. The tattoos came early, etched by a friend in a garage with a needle and string. The Phoenix was the last one, inked the night before he left home. He said it meant freedom, but his mother said it meant trouble. By his 20s, he was caught in something bigger than petty crime. A network of armed robberies tied loosely to political activism that spiraled into violence. No one died, but federal charges stacked like bricks. 10 years later, a violent incident inside another prison earned him a transfer. Threat to institutional security. The paperwork read. That's how he ended up at Florence. His first impression was the silence. The moment the transport van turned into the compound, the world vanished. No cars, no birds, just wind and wire. The gates swallowed him whole. Inside, time didn't move forward, it folded in on itself. The day he entered ADX, a guard told him, "You won't hear another human voice unless we want you to." It sounded like an exaggeration, until it wasn't. At first, he tried to adjust. He did push-ups, read manuals, recited the poems he remembered from school. He scratched a calendar into the wall with a paper clip. But days turned into weeks, and the routine began to eat through him like acid. The lights never went off completely. The meals were tasteless, served on molded trays. He couldn't tell what season it was. From the small slit window, he could only see the sky. In the mornings, it was white and still. By afternoon, it burned orange. He began to name the clouds, strange, human names like Peter and Malik and Ray, until one day he realized he hadn't spoken a word in nearly a month. That was when the hallucinations began. He saw flashes of movement in the corners of his eyes, shadows that weren't there. He heard whispers through the vent system, voices that weren't real but felt too familiar to ignore. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the mind doesn't obey logic in solitude. One night, a faint tapping echoed from his wall. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 knocks, another pause. He froze. Then he tapped back. It became their language, the inmates communicating through plumbing and walls, a Morse code of survival. It was how Jonas met Omar Kane, the man 3 cells away. Omar had been here longer. He had a deep, rhythmic knock, slow and steady. Over time, Jonas learned his story in fragments. Born in London, raised in Brixton, radicalized by anger, caught in the wrong crowd, accused of things he never fully admitted or denied. His body was marked too, geometric tattoos wrapping around his arms like armor. Omar warned him, "The walls don't echo, they absorb." It was true. Everything in ADX was built to swallow sound. When you screamed, it didn't bounce back. It just vanished. Weeks turned into months. Jonas began losing track of dates. The meals came at the same hour. The guards' boots followed the same rhythm. The same fluorescent lights hummed overhead. He stopped trying to talk to them. He stopped trying to write letters. Even the phoenix tattoo on his arm began to fade, the ink dulled by the fluorescent glow. One morning, he received a newspaper, 6 months old. The pages smelled of dust and disinfectant. He ran his fingers over the headlines. Wars, politics, sports. The world outside had kept moving. He felt a sting of envy for people who could walk into sunlight without permission. The hunger strikes began soon after. Rumors spread quietly, men refusing food in protest of isolation, calling it inhumane. Jonas watched them being taken away one by one for medical evaluation. They came back thinner, quieter, their eyes hollow. He told himself he wouldn't be one of them. But then a letter he'd written to his mother came back marked undeliverable. No reason. No apology. Just a void. Something broke inside him that day. He stopped eating dinner. Then breakfast. Then lunch. By the third day, he didn't feel hunger anymore. Only clarity. Omar knocked through the wall. Jonas didn't answer. As his body weakened, his mind sharpened. He began noticing the faint hum of the camera motor moving above his cell, the subtle rhythm of guards' footsteps timed to the second. Everything inside ADX operated like a machine, predictable, precise, merciless. When they finally came for him, 2 officers entered, calm and practiced. He didn't fight. He couldn't. They strapped him into the chair, inserted the tube, poured the liquid feed. The taste was metallic, like drinking electricity. He thought of the bird tattoo on his arm again, a creature that rose from ashes. But ashes, he realized, only rise when something burns. That night, he dreamed of fire. Not destruction, freedom. A city skyline glowing orange. The wind hot against his face. His arms open wide. Then the alarm cut through the dream, jerking him back into the cold concrete box. Down the corridor, a voice screamed for help. Another had collapsed. And the cycle repeated. One man starved. One man was revived. Another disappeared. To the public, ADX Florence was a symbol of justice. To the men inside, it was a slow erasure of existence. Every day chipped away at their memories until even guilt became distant. Jonas would later say, in a letter that never reached anyone, that the worst part wasn't the pain or the hunger. It was the silence, that deep, constant silence that settled in the bones until it became part of you. By the time he was taken for his second feeding, he no longer felt the straps. The tube slid in easily, his body limp with surrender. The nurse avoided his eyes again. Behind her mask, he saw the reflection of himself, a man reduced to a medical procedure. When they wheeled him back to his cell, he looked through the slit window and saw something impossible. A bird, maybe a hawk, maybe a crow, flew past, wings wide, black against the sky. For a second, he imagined it turning, diving, breaking through the glass. But it didn't. It kept flying free. He pressed his palm against the window slit, leaving a faint smear of blood from his nose. It wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance, proof that he still existed. Somewhere, far from that concrete tomb, the world continued. Trains ran, children laughed, rain fell on sidewalks. But inside ADX Florence, the beginning of the end had already begun. And as the lights dimmed again, Jonas whispered the same word he always did before sleep, a word no one else could hear. Freedom. The first thing they lose is the sense of time. Not their name, not their strength, time. It melts away between the fluorescent lights that never go off and the soundless concrete that swallows everything human. Jonas Cruz had learned that the hard way. In ADX Florence, the clock isn't on the wall. It lives inside your head, ticking until you can't hear it anymore. Each day began with a clang that wasn't quite morning and ended with a silence that wasn't quite night. The small hatch on the door would open, a tray would slide in, plastic spoon, gray mush, and a sealed cup of water. Jonas would stare at it for hours before sliding it back untouched. He wasn't hungry. Hunger had left him weeks ago. What remained was something emptier than pain, a protest without a voice. Somewhere down the range, a man was banging on his steel door. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. It was a code, a language of the damned. Jonas tapped back, twice. The noise traveled through the vents like whispers between ghosts. Still breathing? The other man asked through the thin air. Barely. Jonas muttered to no one. The man's name was Deshaun Keller, 29, serving life for armed robbery and the accidental death of a store clerk. He had tattoos that mapped his life, a set of dice near his wrist, a barbed cross on his neck, and the words "never fold" across his chest. ADX had folded him anyway. Deshaun had been in the Range 13 unit, the same one where most hunger strikers were kept. The rumor was that a prisoner had slit his wrists there 2 weeks ago, and the guards didn't find him until the next morning. They said his blood had pooled under the door and stained the hall. No one cleaned it until inspection day. Jonas knew that story wasn't just rumor. He'd seen the guards roll the body bag out. No one said a word. No press, no report. Just a quiet shuffle and the smell of disinfectant. The human body wasn't made to live without sound, touch, or sunlight. In ADX, the silence itself became a kind of torture, a slow suffocation. Psychologists call it SHU syndrome, the mental collapse that comes from prolonged isolation. Men start pacing in circles, talking to shadows, whispering apologies to people who aren't there. Jonas tried to fight it. He'd press his palms against the cold concrete and imagine it was the warmth of a human hand. He'd close his eyes and count each heartbeat like a prayer. But the walls always won. They were designed to win. The prison called it administrative segregation. The inmates called it living burial. The design was deliberate: 7 by 12-foot cells, solid concrete desk and bed, shower inside the cell, a slot for food, and a window too small to see the sky. No physical contact, no communal yard. Recreation meant being led, shackled, to a small concrete pen, alone, for an hour. If the guards allowed it. Sometimes they didn't. One afternoon, Jonas saw a strip of paper pushed under his door. It was folded neatly, the handwriting shaky. "If you're still in this, brother, don't quit. They hate it when we make noise." He didn't know who sent it. Maybe Deshawn, maybe someone 2 doors down. But he held onto that note like it was oxygen. The next morning, the intercom cracked alive, a rare sound. "Inmate Keller, stand by for escort." Jonas froze. That wasn't normal. Hunger strikers weren't usually moved. Minutes later, boots thudded down the hallway. The viewing slit opened, eyes behind glass. Then came a struggle, muffled yelling, chains clanking. Jonas heard a scream, short, desperate, then silence. The kind of silence that means something's gone wrong. Hours later, guards came with mops and black bags. They didn't speak. They never did. Jonas knew what it meant. Another one gone. Another name erased before the world could even know it existed. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat on the cold floor, knees up, staring at the vent. For the first time in years, he felt something close to fear. Not fear of death. He'd made peace with that, but fear of disappearing. He whispered to the darkness, "If I die in here, will anyone even know why?" There was no answer. Only the hum of the ventilation system. The next day, he made a decision, not to die quietly. When the guard slid the tray in, Jonas picked it up and threw it at the door. The sound exploded down the range, bouncing off the walls. He began to shout, words tumbling out in anger and exhaustion. He didn't care if they beat him, didn't care if they chained him. He wanted them to hear that he was still alive. Within minutes, the rapid response team stormed in, black helmets, shields, and electric stun guns. Jonas was yanked out, slammed to the floor, knees on his back, cuffs biting into his wrists. He didn't fight. He just kept saying, "You can't silence all of us." They dragged him down the hall, blood on his cheek, shirt torn, tattoos glistening with sweat. He caught a glimpse of a camera on the ceiling. He looked straight into it and whispered, "Tell them." That footage never left the prison. Weeks later, the hunger strike reached national headlines. Civil rights lawyers filed motions demanding transparency about medical neglect and mental health abuse inside ADX Florence. The Bureau of Prisons responded with the same old phrase: all inmates are treated humanely and receive necessary medical care. But leaked documents told another story. Internal memos from 2023 and 2024 revealed that at least 7 inmates had attempted suicide within 12 months. 3 succeeded. Several others were hospitalized after refusing food for weeks. Among them was Deshawn Keller. His death was listed as medical complications. The official cause never released. Jonas learned the news from a counselor months later. He didn't cry. There were no tears left. Just a long, quiet stare at the floor. He spent his next days writing letters to journalists, to human rights groups, to anyone who might listen. Most came back unopened, stamped rejected by institution. Still, he wrote. Outside the walls, a movement began to stir, small but loud. Former guards, whistleblowers, and family members of inmates started speaking up. They called it the Florence Files, a campaign demanding reform and independent investigation. For the first time, the prison's silence cracked. News outlets picked it up. CNN called ADX a warehouse for the mentally ill. The Guardian described it as a living experiment in sensory deprivation. Former inmates began sharing testimonies, stories of hallucinations, hunger strikes, self-harm, and guards who'd stopped seeing them as human. But inside, Jonas barely knew. He had no access to television, no internet, and letters took months. What he did know was the sound, faint, distant, familiar. Someone else had started banging on their door. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Jonas pressed his forehead to the concrete and smiled weakly. The rhythm was still alive. The hunger strike didn't end that year. It spread to other units, other prisons. The government denied it was happening, but the records, the lawsuits, and the autopsies said otherwise. By the winter of 2025, ADX Florence had a new reputation, not just America's most secure prison, but the quietest battlefield in the country. And somewhere deep within its steel heart, Jonas Cruz, covered in tattoos and scars, whispered to himself, "Silence isn't peace. It's protest." Winter in Colorado carries a kind of silence that feels alive, thick, biting, full of memory. The wind cuts across the mountains, carrying snow that glows faintly under the prison floodlights. ADX Florence stands like a fortress of secrets, surrounded by fences that hum with electricity. On the outside, it looks calm. On the inside, something was finally starting to break. In early 2025, an envelope arrived at a Denver newsroom. No return address, no fingerprints, just a drive inside. The files were marked, Florence internal, restricted. The videos were short, grainy, but unmistakably real. They showed men strapped in restraint chairs, tubes forced into their noses, guards in hazmat suits standing over them. In one clip, an inmate fainted mid-feed while the liquid still dripped. The date stamp read March 14, 2024. The footage spread fast. CNN ran a headline. Leaked videos reveal force-feeding and neglect at ADX Florence. BBC called it the American prison that breaks minds. For the first time, the walls that had swallowed every scream were now echoing across the world. But inside those walls, Jonas Cruz didn't know. He only felt the change. The guard spoke less. The mood shifted. More inspections. More tension. One morning, during his 15 minutes of recreation, he noticed something different. A group of men from the Bureau of Prisons, walking with clipboards, glancing at the cells like tourists afraid to look too long. A new warden had arrived. The guards whispered her name like it mattered, Warden Lisa Harrington. She was known for running tight ships. But unlike her predecessors, she'd been sent after congressional pressure, tasked with restoring compliance. Jonas stood in his wrecked cage, the cold air biting his skin, and shouted, "Hey, you're finally here to see your ghosts." The agents didn't look at him, but Harrington did, just for a second. Their eyes met through the mesh, and that second was enough. Later that week, Jonas was called out for a psychological evaluation, something rare. The room was small, gray, with a desk, 2 chairs, and a woman in a dark suit. She had a notepad and calm eyes. "Jonas Cruz," she began. "You've been refusing food again?" He shrugged. "I eat when I feel seen. You're part of the hunger strike." Was. "Not anymore." "Why stop?" He leaned forward. "Because silence doesn't work anymore. You people finally started listening." The woman didn't respond. She just wrote something down and said quietly, "Things are changing here." Jonas almost laughed. "Change. You can repaint a coffin, ma'am, but it's still a box." Outside the prison, investigations intensified. The leaked videos triggered public outrage. Civil rights attorneys filed emergency motions. Lawmakers demanded hearings. For the first time in decades, ADX Florence wasn't invisible. Reports surfaced of at least 5 confirmed suicides in the last 2 years. One of them, Deshaun Keller, was finally identified by name. His mother, living in Atlanta, told the press her son hadn't been allowed a phone call for 3 years. "They buried him before he died," she said. Her words echoed across news stations and social media. The Bureau of Prisons promised reform. They replaced several administrators, reviewed mental health protocols, and limited the use of prolonged solitary confinement. But inside, not much changed overnight. For men like Jonas, hope was a rumor that arrived late and left early. He'd begun to write again. This time, not letters, but journals. On scraps of paper smuggled from the library, he scribbled everything he saw. The faces, the sounds, the hunger, the silence. He called it the quiet revolt. One guard, a younger recruit named Torres, found one of the pages during a cell check. Instead of destroying it, he pocketed it. "You got something here, Cruz," he whispered. You should keep writing. Jonas smiled. You should keep reading. Torres would later leak those pages anonymously online. They went viral. Readers called them haunting, unfiltered, the most honest thing ever written from inside a Supermax. Weeks turned into months. The investigations dragged on, as they always do. Attention shifted. The headlines cooled. But the story didn't die. In April 2025, a documentary aired on national television, Buried Voices, Inside America's Supermax. It featured testimonies from former inmates, lawyers, and even ex-guards who described the hunger strikes, suicides, and the unseen psychological war within ADX Florence. One of the closing segments showed excerpts from the Quiet Revolt. Viewers around the world heard Jonas's words read aloud. If you listen closely, silence has a sound. It's the heartbeat of men who refuse to disappear. The response was explosive. Petitions called for Jonas's release. Activists flooded Congress with letters. Celebrities shared his story online. But inside the prison, Jonas didn't see any of it. He only felt the shift, small things, like the guards speaking softer, or the air during rec being a little longer. Then, one morning in June, he was told to pack up. Transfer order. No explanation. No destination. He asked the guard, "Where to?" "Somewhere quieter," the man said with a smirk. They cuffed him, walked him through the long gray corridor. The same one where he'd once seen gurneys roll by. The same walls that had heard everything and said nothing. As he stepped into the transport van, he looked back once. For the first time, sunlight hit his face full on. It felt unreal, like touching warmth for the first time in years. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Tell them we existed." Months later, word spread that Jonas had been transferred to a lower security facility in Oregon. There were no updates, no interviews, no photos, just rumors that he was alive and still writing. Meanwhile, ADX Florence continued to operate. Some say it's quieter now. Others say it's not silence, it's exhaustion. The kind that comes when a place has too many ghosts and not enough space to hold them. In 2025, the Justice Department released a brief report. It read, "The Federal Bureau of Prisons has implemented new mental health guidelines and is reviewing conditions at high-security facilities, including ADX Florence." No apologies. No mention of the dead. Just policy. But the world had already heard the story, through leaked footage, torn notebook pages, and whispers that made it past the walls. In a diner outside Denver, a former guard named Torres sits by the window, sipping coffee. He carries a small tattoo on his wrist now, a black phoenix. "I got it for him," he says quietly to the reporter across the table. "For crews. For the ones who never made it out." The reporter asks, "Do you think anything really changed?" Torres stares out at the mountains and answers, "Maybe not yet. But at least, for once, the silence didn't win." The camera pans over the snowy peaks, the prison faintly visible in the distance, just a speck of concrete against endless white. The wind carries no sound, but if you listen hard enough, you might hear it. The faint echo of a heartbeat inside the quietest place in America. If you've watched this far, remember this. ADX Florence isn't just a building. It's a mirror, a reflection of what happens when security replaces humanity and silence becomes policy. Behind every locked door, there's a name, a voice, a story that wasn't supposed to be heard. The truth is out now, but what happens next depends on us. Because some prisons aren't made of walls. They're made of silence.